Good day and welcome to Of Many Things, the live stream from America Media. I'm Father Matt Malone. I'm the editor-in-chief of America Magazine. I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Those are big and important words, and we say them nearly every week at Mass and every day when we say the Rosary. But what do they actually mean? And what do we mean when we profess our belief in the resurrection of the body? This week, Dr. Scott Hahn, a biblical theologian at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, has released a new book that seeks to explore that question. Hope to Die, the Christian Meaning of Death and the Resurrection of the Body, which Dr. Hahn wrote with Emily Stimson Chapman, is an exploration of the significance of death and burial from a Catholic perspective. There is no more important topic generally, and these questions take on an additional significance in a time of such devastation, suffering, and death. And he joins us now. Professor Hahn, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you, Father Matt.
So why don't we start at the very beginning? What do we mean when we say those words, I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come?
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, we say a whole lot more than we realize because we look forward to the resurrection of the dead. We know from the Creed that it's the resurrection of the body, the soma, and for Socratics or for Plato, the soma, the body was a sema, a tomb. But for us, the body is something like a sacrament of the soul, the very person, a visible sign of this invisible reality that I am, that you are, that we discover. But even more radically than just the resurrection of the dead, the necroi, or the body, the soma, the original form of the Creed back in the first century appears to have been the sarx, the resurrection of the flesh. And it's sort of like, no wonder Augustine said of all of the articles of the Creed, this is the one that is the most incomprehensible and generates the most opposition because it's sort of unthinkable that we would get the flesh back. It's almost undesirable. And yet the Creator and the Redeemer are one and the same deity. Jesus says, I make all things new, not I make new things to replace the old ones. And so There's a mystery of faith here that's almost too good to be true, except that it is. And this is why I think we have to look at life and recognize, okay, there's life that's a gift, it's sacred, but then there is life that is divine. And the gift of God is not just life, it is God himself who gave himself to our first parents. And what we call original sin is the forfeiting of that divine life. What we call original sin is not children born depraved, as I once believed as a Calvinist pastor, but children born deprived of a life that is divine. We have human life, and that's good. But what Christ has come to do in assuming our human nature, in assuming our weakness and mortality, is to impart to us not only a share in his divine nature, but a share in his redeemed humanity. It isn't just divinization, it's also hominization. We are more fully, truly human through the resurrection, but we're not done yet, because ultimately the deed is only going to be consummated when we get our bodies back in glory like he did. And it's sort of like, okay, those are a lot of dots to connect, but really we call them the 12 Articles of the Creed.
So in those few words, we are saying a lot. These are big promises. These are big ideas. And yet you decided, I'm gonna try to tackle them in this book. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book and what you really wanted to say in it.
Well, you always have your initial reasons for writing a book. And then when you're done, you discover that there were other reasons that came from on high. And I had my timing. I wanted to come out in time for Easter of 2020. And then God had his own timing, I suppose, because there was a pandemic that I didn't see coming. So I ended up rewriting the last chapter on February 29th, since we're a leap year, and looking at it in the light of what's come down upon us. But I ultimately, my main motivation really does, it is this, that we love life and we dread death, and that's normal. But I don't think we recognize that life that is invisible, that is not less but more valuable, that divine life, but it's also more vulnerable. And we work so hard to kind of preserve a life that is ultimately going to be lost no matter what, since we all know the mortality rate is 100%. But the immortality rate is too. And so we have to recognize that this life that seems so long is going to seem so short when we get to the other side. And so what we do matters, and what we do with our own material body matters as well, not just individually, but socially, not just physically, but spiritually. And so you look at the articles of the Creed. I wrote a book about 4 years ago called The Creed. And I think we usually assume that's sort of like, well, we've learned that since we were kids. And these are sort of like Catholic talking points, stones that we pull out, and then when you blow off the dust, you begin to recognize these aren't just stones. My dad was a jeweler. I took stones for granted until I realized what amethysts and rubies and emeralds were in the rings that he designed. And I see the articles of the Creed that we profess at the hinge point of the Sunday Mass as being something that we have neglected. And so in basically defamiliarizing ourselves and then kind of refamiliarizing ourselves with these things that we've heard all of our lives that we think we say too much, but actually ponder too little, we begin to realize, man, this is good news, the likes of which not only does the world not get, but I'm not sure how many of us Catholics really get it either. So
right. How many have really taken it into our hearts?
Exactly. I mean, I'm thinking of Luke 2:19. She pondered all these things in her heart, so she wasn't just kind of recalling past events and journaling. She was pondering and making deeper connections than I suppose we're probably able to make.
So the reunion of body and soul in some form, as you said at the start, it seems so incomprehensible. It seems like such a big idea. It's interesting. As a priest, it's something that I'm not asked a lot about, and I think in part it's because people don't even know what questions to ask about it because it seems so big. So what are the most common questions that you encounter among Catholics or misunderstandings, and how do you address them in this book?
Yeah, I mean, I begin the book by describing a question that came from my own mom after I preached my first funeral service as a Presbyterian pastor. And it was for my grandmother. And I spoke on John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. And afterwards, my mom complimented me on the sermon, but she said, "You don't really believe that." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I do." And what became clear was my mom wasn't really sure she wanted her body back. It's
Right.
like a disposable wrapper or a carton. Once you empty of its contents, what good is this cardboard? And so we had a conversation that set in motion a kind of thought that I just think that most Catholics, and she was a Protestant, but I mean, most Christians don't realize that the body itself was created good and it was meant to last. And then it was redeemed. It was taken to an even higher level. And so in Judaism, you see a reverence for the body that is sort of, without precedent. You see it in Tobit and elsewhere. And then Christianity takes this to the next level with the martyrs, and so on. But I don't think we just want to reduce this to the way we treat the martyrs' bodies and care for relics and that sort of thing. This should cause us to kind of look in the mirror and realize God loves my body probably more than I do. And we have that kind of love-hate relate. We indulge it too much, and so we feel contempt for it later. And God wants to not only use the body, but he also wants to redeem it. And he wants to reunite body and soul in the resurrection, but he also wants to help us overcome the alienation we have towards our own body and other people's too.
Mm. And it seems to me that this belief is at the heart of the rituals that we enact when a body dies, when someone dies. And of course, I think that's on our minds a lot right now because in many places we don't have access to those very familiar rituals,
Right.
and that can be confusing and bewildering. But there's also a sort of general confusion about some of those things, isn't there? I note on Google that the second most Googled term after your name is cremation, right? And you talk a little bit about in the book about how Catholics have understood that or misunderstood it, and your own view of it. I wonder if you could let our audience know about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, this is not a tirade against cremation. The book actually came as a result of an invitation that I had to come up to Manhattan to address about 15 professionals. Some were attorneys, chaplains, just lay people, ethicists, and this sort of thing. And I don't even know why I said yes to the invitation.
Mhm.
I found it intriguing, but I was sort of regretting it until the evening was over. And I realized that this lecture became a dialecture instead of an hour, it was 3 hours. And, it was an argument not from necessity or authority, but from fittingness, that if God has treated our bodies this way, how should we treat them in turn? And so I wanted to kind of re-examine the church's teachings on cremation to show that in pagan antiquity, cremation was a commonplace. And then with Christianity, after the resurrection, it just simply went away. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, as anti-Catholic movements like the Bolsheviks and the Freemasons and the Philosophes and so on, they weaponized cremation to kind of subvert the faith of the ordinary Catholics in the resurrection of the body, and with real effectiveness. So that by the 1960s, the Pope Paul VI didn't approve or endorse cremation. He simply permitted it by way of concession, because by the second half of the 20th century, people were no longer aware of cremation as being a sort of anti-Catholic strategy as it had been in the late
Right.
1700s and 1800s. And so I would say the church permits cremation, but approves the sacred customs for the burial of the body. And even with cremation, you're not just to scatter the ashes, to the four corners of
Right.
the
Right.
winds, but put them in holy ground and so on. And I think we have to go back and revisit the incarnation, the paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of the body, and realize, why does God have to become man? Why does he have to suffer and die? Why can't he just forgive us? Why does it take three persons who are divine to save one that's human? Why does he go to all of this trouble? It's so messy. And then when we
Right.
discover that, wow, this is more glorious, goes beyond our wildest dreams, we ought to go back and just allow ourselves to rethink the way we treat our body both before and after death.
And so it's the case that the church permits cremation, but as you say, it finds the burial of the body a more fitting tribute or symbol to to the reality that we express in our faith, which is that the soul and the body will be reunited. But what does that actually look like? I mean, even in the Gospels, it's hard to it's hard to know exactly how the disciples perceived the glorified body of the Lord, right? What does that reality look like? Is how can we even begin to imagine it?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus said some things that must have struck the disciples as inane, just like the people surrounding him. Jairus' daughter, she's not dead; she's just asleep. Stick
Right.
to theology, forget medicine. Your career lies elsewhere. And likewise with Lazarus, he's asleep. Well, he'll wake up. Well, he's dead. Well, why didn't you say so? Because I don't think that word means what you think it means. You think you know what death means, but there's a deeper kind of death that is the loss of life that is divine. And eternal life is the main theme of John's gospel, but it's an elusive concept. But at the same time, the incarnation grounds it. It tethers it to our flesh, to Jesus' flesh. And so, I mentioned in the book that my dad wanted to be cremated, and my mom too. I kind of talked him out of it reluctantly. He conceded. Later, he was glad, and she was especially. And I just think that if we approach the faith simply in terms of propositional truths, I mean, they're all true. But as Aquinas says, our faith doesn't terminate in propositions, but in the realities that are conveyed by means of the propositions. And so, the faith is more caught than taught. And so when
Right.
we approach weddings or births or deaths with an openness to just how fleshly, how physical. The physical side of being spiritual is much more than we realize, and it's much more beautiful and powerful in not only embodying the faith, but in transmitting it from one generation to the next. And I think that's what's lost, at least potentially, with the permission granted in the 60s. It became about 5%. Now, some decades later, it's over 50% of Catholics opt for cremation. And
Mhm.
again, I'm not trying to open up another front in the culture war besides, abortion, contraception, and now we're going to have cremation. But I
Right.
do think that this would be a fitting way for us to kind of revisit the gospel and realize that, that God is more physical than we are in most ways.
Yeah. I think, I mean, one of the things that I really liked about the book, and your method more generally, is that uh, you take seriously these claims that we make, and you want to go into them in depth, precisely because at those moments of life and death, especially in relation to the sacraments, we don't want to just be talking about, well, what is the rule, what is the discipline, but what's actually behind it, right? And more importantly, who is the person behind it, and what has he revealed to us? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking, that the rule of faith that we profess in the creed is so much more than we can possibly comprehend. And yet at the same time, the more we contemplate it, the more we realize this is what causes us as Catholics to transcend the liberal and the conservative, the polarization of our political, context. And, nothing is more liberating than these sacred mysteries. And so we ought to conserve them. But, we're a family and these are sacred mysteries. And as I alluded to a few minutes ago, my dad was a jeweler growing up. And so I just kind of took jewels for granted. He wasn't wealthy. He just made rings for middle-class folks, but he actually designed them as an artist. And so I just took these rocks for granted until I was at his funeral and I was the lector. And the pastor in the homily said, "How many of you are wearing Fred Hahn's rings?" And over half the congregation. And suddenly we were bound together in, the beauty of something as simple as jewelry. And I think that the sacred mysteries are like precious gems, the pearl of great price, the hope, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
I think we blow off the dust and we realize we are united by mysteries that are almost too good to be true, except this is the Catholic gospel.
Yeah. And this book comes out in at a time of a global pandemic,
Right.
and of an economic depression, or certainly a Great Recession, in which we're thinking about questions of life and death. Literally, we're thinking about the material. What do you think that this book has to say to us, that's specific to this crisis that we're living through?
I point out that we tend to live like materialists and die like nihilists, because we're in the grip of a fear, and we can see it now with this pandemic more clearly. You might say 20/20 vision. I think what we have to do is to step back and look at this fear of death, which is perfectly normal, but recognize how disordered it is. Not because death isn't dreadful, it is, but because there's so much more to this life than what we experience here and now. And we know it, or we say we believe it. But the way the early Christians lived, and died, and not only took care of their own dead, but also the pagan neighbors surrounding them. I think the way they celebrated life and they could approach death in a way that was more fearless than even the Stoics. I mean, this had the power to convert the Roman Empire. Talk about a culture of death. And I think it has that same power now if we just kind of feel as though we don't have to just defend the faith all the time or explain it. I think if we proclaim it and contemplate it, it's sort of like letting a lion out of his cage. He's going to do a better job of defending himself than we can. And I just feel the Catholic faith is something that is needing to be unleashed in its beauty and not just its authority or its truthfulness. That too, but especially the beauty.
Mm. And one of the questions that I'm asked when I'm talking to folks during this epidemic is, how do we make sense of this evil? Is this somehow a punishment from God? Is it somehow a divine punishment? The papal preacher, the Holy Father himself, a huge number of theologians have said that's not a good word to use, not the right concept to use. I know you excited some controversy by using that word in an interview on another platform. And I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that makes sense out of what God does in relationship to us in the world, and not only when we're righteous, but when we fall short, it is love. The inner logic of divine love is elusive, but it is the only thing that makes everything kind of coherent and united. And so when you look at Scripture and you realize, okay, God punishes, and you can't get away from it, even if you want to avoid it, you recognize that God doesn't punish his people because they stop being his people. He doesn't start punishing them because he stops loving them. He punishes them because he can't stop loving them. The same reason why I punished my kids and not the neighbor's kids.
Right.
But I don't punish my kids perfectly. God doesn't punish us to get us, to get back at us. He punishes us to get us back to him. There's a restorative element. The logic of love shows that it's all about reconciliation, helping us to take responsibility, but also helping us to see that he is calling us to a love that goes beyond our dreams. It's more demanding than we realized. It's also something that we ought to trust him and live out as much as possible. I do think that the term punishment ought to be used with great caution, because it is more likely to elicit misunderstanding than proper understanding. But at the same time, there is something of a teachable moment that if you can rehabilitate a notion like that, you can probably rehabilitate anything.
Right.
But I do think we need to recognize that that justice is based on love. And the two are not intentional. We tend to assume that, to the extent that you show justice, there's no mercy. And likewise, to the extent that you dispense mercy, you undermine justice. And the cross is proof that the two are married. There is the greatest crime that the human race has ever committed against God, and there is the single greatest act whereby God redeemed us. He redeemed his torturers and executioners while on the it's like, seriously? You believe that? What else is true? How else do we rethink this?
So even if we understand this crisis, this event, in the very narrow, specific way that you've defined punishment, but we agree that that's maybe not the best word to use because it does elicit confusion. What is, in your judgment, the best theological symbol for understanding this crisis that we're living through?
Well, I do think that what we are allowed to experience in this life are afflictions that seem so catastrophic. And yet at the same time, I think when you extend a little bit of credit to God and trust him more than we trust our experts, we begin to realize that through suffering, we are transformed. Not only do we learn deferred gratification and no pain, no gain, but we also learn that love itself, not just as it comes from God, but as it is coming from us, love can be warm, fuzzy feelings and nothing more apart from sacrifice. And what is sacrifice but suffering? And we don't want to suffer. We seldom initiate that. And yet when we suffer, we come out on the other side in a kind of personal exodus where we're sort of extracted from our own selfish selves and empowered to live more generously to other people. It's sort of like, okay, God, with all due respect, something short of a pandemic would do just fine. I just don't know what would do just fine. And I don't look at this and say, well, we can explain this handily, in terms of a theodicy, explaining the ways of God to man when it comes to the problem of evil or whatever. But I do think a little trust goes a long way. And the cross to me is that thing that shows us that the weakness of God is stronger than human strength, and that the foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of humans. And as we ponder this through Lent, through Holy Week, through the Triduum, and now leading up to Pentecost, I do believe that we'll discover that the sacred mysteries of our faith are not only precious and true, but powerful, and the only things capable of illuminating why he didn't just bear a cross, but bestows crosses on every single one of us, because it's the resurrection.
And that's a great place to end our conversation on the resurrection, Dr. Hahn. The book is called Hope to Die, The Christian Meaning of Death and the Resurrection of the Body. And I enjoyed reading it. And thank you very much for offering it for our reading and reflection.
You're welcome. Great to be with you, Father Matt.
Good to be with you, too. It was a very interesting book, and I recommend it to you, our readers and our listeners. There's a lot of commentary going on right now about what is happening in the church and in the world vis-a-vis this crisis, both the economic crisis and the public health crisis. Some you will agree with, some of you will not. Some I agree with, some I do not. The purpose of this forum, this live stream, but also the larger purpose of American media is to host a conversation among those voices. I myself also was impressed this week by a piece that I saw at America by David Hollenbach. And David Hollenbach is a theologian at Georgetown University. And he published an article on our website, americamagazine.org, that is called Who Suffers Most During the Coronavirus Crisis. And in that piece, he really examines the full force of unjust structures and how they place refugees and very poor people at great risk, and how all of that has been revealed through these twin crises. He also makes some practical suggestions from the richness of Catholic social teaching for how to address the crisis and to create systemic change. It is a really great piece, and I also recommend that to you. Professor Hollenbach, Professor Hahn, they come from different, they focus on different things in theology, and they have different views of theology and come from different theological schools. There's nothing new there. That has been with us throughout the history of the church. But I do know this with some certainty. America Magazine is the only place where you can read both of them because of that mission that I spoke to earlier of bringing together a diversity of voices in one place, in conversation, in argument, reflecting on the nature of ideas and their implications for all of us. One question that I received after last week's episode was how do we actually select the guests to come on this program? Usually, it's people that we know who are doing some interesting work that could speak to what is happening in the world right now. So you could think of our conversation today with Professor Hahn, for example, as one in a series of conversations about how these twin crises, the public health crisis, the economic crisis, are playing out in the life of the church and the world at this very moment. So we spoke first to Cardinal Dolan, who's the Archbishop of the city that has been the epicenter of this global pandemic. We then spoke to our friends at the Partnership Network here in New York, who have responsibility for several schools in the poorest neighborhoods, several Catholic schools in the poorest neighborhoods in this city. And we talked a bit about what challenges they are facing right now, the economic distress that their students are undergoing, and particularly as a result of the fact that their parents, many of whom were living on the margins to begin with, are now unemployed. Today, we talked with Dr. Hahn about sort of spirituality and church teaching around death and bodily resurrection. And in the episodes ahead, we're going to talk to folks in higher education. We're going to talk to folks who are working in international affairs. And we're going to talk to folks who are working in the media to get their takes on how they see this pandemic, these twin crises, as I mentioned, from their perspective, from what they do day in and day out. Thank you so much for joining us here today. For all of our content, you can find it at americamagazine.org. Be sure to follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram and all that good stuff, and Facebook, of course. And also be sure to like our page and subscribe to it on YouTube so that you can keep up with the latest video updates. This is but one program in America's video offerings. There are several really great ones out there, including the Facebook live stream of Father Jim Martin, who's doing a daily reflection on the readings, which many people, including myself, have found to be a great comfort during this very trying time. Please know that you, our readers, our audience, continue to be in our prayers every day, and we ask for yours. I thank you for watching. God bless you, and have a great week.